ability to beat that type of competition 18 times in major championships tells me that he is the best player.
It's great to be back with my buddy. God, it's been a long time, huh?
It has been a long time.
Are you buying dinner tonight, or are we splitting it?
So boom, it all happened, right? I play golf, go out to New South Wales and meet him. He's on the tee waiting.
At 79, David Graham stands as one of golf's true champions. A two-time major winner who conquered Oakland Hills in 1979 and played what many call the perfect round at Merion in 1981. His final round at the U.S. Open was flawless. 18 greens in regulation, just one missed fairway. A closing 67 that left no doubt. Graham was a master of the game, a perfectionist who built his legacy through sheer grinding will and practice until his hands bled. But behind the major championships and the perfect rounds lies a darker story. A story of feuds, betrayals, and a mutiny that changed golf forever. A story about six golfers David Graham hated more than anyone else. The 1996 President's Cup should have been Graham's crowning achievement. Instead, it became his nightmare. On a damp evening at Royal Lytham, 12 players voted unanimously to remove him as captain. It was the first and only successful mutiny in professional golf history. The men who destroyed his leadership weren't random rebels. They were specific enemies, each with their own grievances, each with their own reasons to want Graham gone. And at the center of it all was the man Graham blamed most, the ringleader who turned the team against him. But before we get to that modern betrayal, we need to understand the oldest feud, the one that shaped everything else. Peter Thomson was everything David Graham was not. Where Graham left school at 14 to work in a golf shop, Thomson was educated and articulate. Where Graham practiced in poverty with bleeding hands, Thomson glided through the game with natural grace. Thomson was a 5-time Open champion, a patriarch of Australian golf, a man of the Melbourne establishment who represented the social elite that Graham could never quite join. Their rivalry exploded in 1972 at the Australian Open. Graham and Thomson tied for the lead, forcing an 18-hole playoff. On the very first hole, with the gallery watching, Graham hit his drive out of bounds. It was a catastrophic mistake. Thomson made birdie and opened a 3-stroke lead instantly. He cruised to a 6-stroke victory while Graham suffered through every painful shot. It was not just a loss, it was a public humiliation. Thomson had embarrassed him in front of the Australian golf world, reinforcing every insecurity Graham carried about not truly belonging. For 24 years, that defeat haunted Graham. And then in 1996, when the players mutinied and forced Graham to resign, they chose Peter Thomson to replace him. Not a contemporary, not a neutral figure. Thomson, the 66-year-old godfather who represented everything Graham had fought against his entire career. The symbolism was devastating. The players were saying they preferred the establishment patriarch over Graham. They were saying that even at 79, even with 2 major championships, Graham still did not truly belong. Thomson accepted the role and immediately imposed a gag order on the team to stop the media circus. The irony was brutal. The players had revolted against Graham's supposed authoritarianism, only to install an even older authority figure who silenced them. For Graham, being replaced by Thomson confirmed his darkest belief. The inner circle would always close ranks against him. Now let's talk about the man who actually led the mutiny, Greg Norman. By 1996, Norman was the biggest star in golf, world #1, the Great White Shark, a global brand who transcended the sport. Where Graham believed in the supremacy of the institution, Norman believed in the supremacy of the individual. Where Graham saw the captaincy as a military rank that demanded obedience, Norman saw it as a service role designed to facilitate the talent. Their feud started 2 years earlier at the inaugural President's Cup in 1994. Norman had withdrawn due to flu but showed up on Sunday to support the team. CBS producer Frank Cherkinian saw gold. He wanted to wire Norman for sound and let him roam inside the ropes as a reporter. It would have been incredible television. The biggest star in golf, mic'd up, giving viewers an inside look at team competition. But Graham vetoed it instantly. His reason was blunt. The President's Cup is not Greg Norman's tournament. It's a 12-man team. It's not Greg's team. Graham thought he was protecting the competition's integrity and keeping focus on the players actually competing. Norman took it as a personal insult, a public reminder that Graham held power over the biggest star in the world. Norman was steamed, and he held that grudge for 2 full years. In the summer of 1996, the Cold War turned hot. Graham attempted to instill discipline by ordering all international team members to report to Virginia on Monday, September 9th, for practice and team bonding. Norman informed Graham he would not arrive until Wednesday. He cited personal and business commitments. To Graham, this was pure insubordination. He drew a line in the sand. You can't have players arrive on Monday and Greg show up at his convenience. He believed that granting Norman an exception would destroy team unity. He was completely wrong. The team was Norman. When Graham forced a choice between the captain's rules and the star's convenience, the other players rallied behind the star. They decided that if Greg wasn't coming until Wednesday, neither were they. Graham's attempt to assert authority resulted in the complete evaporation of it. His scheduling ultimatum backfired spectacularly and turned the entire team against him. While Norman was was the powerful ringleader, Steve Elkington was the vocal aggressor pushing the locker room into open revolt. The 1995 PGA champion represented a new breed of Australian golfer, Americanized, brash, and utterly irreverent toward tradition. Elkington had zero patience for Graham's schoolmaster approach. Reports indicate he was unhappy with Graham's managerial style well before the coup. Unlike the stoic Graham, who viewed golf as a grim battle for survival, Elkington was known for his sharp tongue and willingness to engage in conflict. He would later become notorious on social media for feuds with other players. The conflict with Elkington was less about a specific incident and more about a fundamental culture clash. Graham demanded reverence. Elkington offered sarcasm. Graham expected players to share his work ethic and military discipline. Elkington wanted flexibility and respect for the modern professional's lifestyle. Elkington was one of the primary voices in the locker room, convincing younger players that Graham was out of touch. He viewed Graham's logistical demands as irrational and his entire leadership style as selfish. Graham saw Elkington as emblematic of a generation that had lost its way, a generation of spoiled millionaires who didn't understand duty or sacrifice. Their mutual contempt made compromise impossible. Perhaps the most painful betrayal came not from his enemies, but from someone who tried to support him, Frank Nobilo. The thoughtful New Zealander was initially one of the few players willing to engage with Graham's process. In March 1996, Graham called a team meeting at the Players' Championship to discuss logistics and strategy. Of dozens of prospective team members, only two showed up, Craig Perry and Frank Nobilo. This attendance suggests Nobilo was initially a good soldier, willing to respect the captain's position. He was not part of the initial clique of dissenters, but by July 1996, Nobilo had joined the mutiny. He voted unanimously with the others to remove Graham. This flip is devastating evidence of Graham's complete failure as a leader. It implies that in the months between the failed March meeting and the July coup, Graham's behavior, his lack of communication, or his rigidity alienated even the moderate, reasonable voices in the room. When Graham lost Nobilo, the man who had actually shown up when others didn't, he lost his claim to any moral high ground. It proved the dissatisfaction wasn't just an Australian clique issue, since Nobilo was a Kiwi. It wasn't a superstar ego issue, since Nobilo was a journeyman pro compared to Norman. It was a universal rejection of Graham's leadership by every single player on the team. Vijay Singh represented the non-Australian contingent. His relationship with Australian golf was already complicated. Earlier in his career, he had been temporarily banned from the Australian tour over unpaid debts to administrators. Singh was known for his singular, obsessive focus on his own game. He had zero interest in team politics, bonding sessions, or the history of the game. He cared about his practice range time and his preparation routine, period. Singh joined the revolt not out of deep personal animosity toward Graham, but out of cold pragmatism. Graham's chaotic organization, the fog that Norman described publicly, and his rigid demand for early arrival threatened Singh's preparation routine. When the powerful bloc of Norman, Price, and Elkington moved against Graham, Singh voted with them to ensure the path of least resistance. For Graham, Singh's vote was a brutal reminder that his reputation as a major champion held no currency with a man who respected only current form and personal preparation. Singh's participation ensured the vote was unanimous, denying Graham any faction of support to cling to. It was the final nail. And then there was Nick Price. The inclusion of Price in Graham's list of enemies is significant because of Price's reputation. Known as one of the nicest, most fair-minded men in golf, Price's participation in the coup gave it moral legitimacy. If only Norman and Elkington had revolted, Graham could have dismissed it as the tantrums of egomaniacs. But Price? Price was the 1994 Open champion and a man of immense integrity. When Price sided with Norman, stating "we did this as a team," it devastated Graham emotionally. He felt deeply betrayed. He expected Price to be the voice of reason who would uphold the tradition of respecting the captain. Instead, Price chose peer solidarity over institutional hierarchy. He chose his friendship with Norman over his respect for the position of captain, and that choice crushed Graham's morale completely. The feud was ultimately with the collective entity of the 1996 international team. The mutiny took place in a meeting room at the British Open. Present were PGA Tour Commissioner Tim Fincham, who tried desperately to save Graham, and the players: Norman, Price, Elkington, Els, Singh, Nobilo, David Frost, Mark McNulty, Robert Allenby, Michael Campbell, and Craig Perry. 12 men who voted unanimously to remove their captain. Ernie Els, the young lion and 1994 U.S. Open champion, represented the future of golf. He had no personal history with Graham. He had never experienced Graham's leadership before. His decision was based purely on following the lead of the veterans. His indifference to Graham's legacy was perhaps more painful than Norman's active hatred. Els simply didn't care about what Graham had accomplished in 1979 or 1981. To Els, 1981 might as well have been 1881. Graham was just an old man getting in the way of their preparation. The young star's casual dismissal of everything Graham had built hurt more than any direct confrontation could have. Graham later described the group's decision as an absolute fiasco and suggested the ringleaders should be suspended. He viewed them not as a team, but as a mob that had attacked attacked his credibility, his honor, and his commitment. He felt that everything he had worked for, every painful practice session, every sacrifice, every major championship, meant nothing to these millionaires. The emotional wound never healed. Commissioner Tim Finchem fought for Graham until he was blue in the face. He understood the dangerous precedent. If players could fire a captain, the tour lost control of its own event. The institution was being undermined. But the players ignored him completely. This moment marked a definitive shift in the balance of power in professional golf. The inmates were now running the asylum. Player power had defeated institutional authority. The timeline of failure was brutal. September 1994, Graham denies Norman's TV request. March 1996, only 2 players show up to Graham's meeting. June 1996, Norman publicly complains the team is in a fog. July 1996, Graham demands Monday arrival. Norman refuses. The scheduling war begins. July 1996, at Lytham, the vote happens. 12-0. Graham is forced to resign. Peter Thomson replaces him. September 1996, under Thomson, the international team loses anyway. Graham's resignation statement was bitter and accurate. He said the mutiny cast a shadow over this event that may never go away. For years, the President's Cup was defined by internal strife rather than golf. The emotional toll on Graham was devastating. He retreated from the international team ecosystem, a king in exile. Later, he suffered from congestive heart failure that ended his Champions Tour career. In interviews years afterward, the pain was still raw. He spoke of jealousies and unfairness. He felt robbed of a crowning honor by spoiled millionaires who didn't understand duty. The verdict is harsh but clear. David Graham was a 1950s character living in a 1990s world. He believed his 2 major championships gave him the right to command. He did not understand that in the modern era, respect must be earned relationally, not just positionally. His ousting was cruel, public, and humiliating, but it was also inevitable. When a leader demands discipline from a group that values autonomy, when that leader is opposed by the most powerful figure in the sport and the most respected, the result is predetermined. Graham's iron fist had turned to rust. The 6 golfers David Graham hated tell the story of a man out of time. Peter Thomson, the establishment figure who humiliated him in 1972 and replaced him in 1996. Greg Norman, the charismatic superstar who led the revolt over scheduling and ego. Steve Elkington, the brash modern player who mocked his authority. Frank Nobilo, the loyalist who flipped and proved the rejection was universal. Vijay Singh, the pragmatist who voted for efficiency over respect. And the collective team, including Nick Price and Ernie Els, who chose solidarity over hierarchy. But despite the pain and the feuds and the bitter ending, David Graham remains a monumental figure in golf history. The man who played the perfect round at Merion. The champion who conquered Oakland Hills with a comeback that would have destroyed a lesser competitor. His legacy is complicated by the 1996 mutiny, but it cannot be erased by it. Graham taught the sport about perfection, about grinding through adversity, about building something brick by painful brick. The President's Cup eventually found its footing and became a respected competition. And David Graham, even in defeat, showed us what happens when values collide, when generations clash, and when a perfectionist who mastered the mechanics of the game failed to comprehend the mechanics of men. If you found this story fascinating, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Which of these 6 golfers do you think was most justified in their stance against Graham? Was Norman right to fight for player autonomy, or was Graham right to demand discipline? Let me know your thoughts below. The lonely champion walks away from team golf, but his major championships remain untouched. His perfect round at Merion still studied, and his place in history secure even if his leadership was rejected. Sometimes the greatest champions on the course struggle most with leading others. David Graham mastered golf, but the mutiny proved that mastering people requires different skills entirely. His story remains a cautionary tale about authority, respect, and the changing nature of professional sports. At 79, David Graham can look back on 2 major championships and 1 spectacular failure, and perhaps that makes him more human than any perfect round ever could.